So almost 2 full years ago now, I received an email here at the library asking us to take a survey about our local history collection and our outreach to local Indigenous communities. Even just reading the questions of the survey showed us how much more we could be doing to incorporate Indigenous voices and accurate historical texts in our collections. And that survey was sent out by our speakers here tonight. And it led to further development of our collection and our educational resources, as well as many conversations about inclusion and accessibility. And so we are very grateful to Lou and Jed for kicking it all off. And I'd like to now introduce you to them. Lou Marie Judge is a librarian, musician, and printmaker who currently works at the West Springfield Public Library in the Adult Services Department. Besides working in public libraries, Lou has also been a research assistant at Harvard, a lecturer at Keene State College, a teacher, audiovisual archivist, and has spent time on the lecture circuit in Hungary. She holds a BA in Film Critical Studies, an MA in Film Theory, and a forthcoming MS in Library and Information Science. Her research interests include gender studies, social justice in library and information science, technofeminism, and disability studies. Jed Crook has spent much of his career working at the intersection of social justice and education. He worked internationally with Protestant and Catholic youth from Northern Ireland, as well as locally here as as well as locally, sorry, I inserted a word that changed the context of the whole sentence. As the assistant supervisor and resource educator of the adolescent boys unit at the Nashua Children's Home. He studied the role of colonialism in K-12 science education at Keene State, where he worked in the Office for Multicultural Student Support and Success. Jed currently works with the Organization of Refugee and Immigrant Success in empowering refugees and new Americans through food sovereignty and small-scale agricultural entrepreneurship, as well as independently through his own regenerative farming and landscaping business. And with that, I will now turn it over to Lou Marie and Jed.
Thank you so much to Katie, Paulina, Nicole, and to all of you online and here in the space with us. We're really excited, and it's really nice to like hear the connection point of like, oh, I got this survey. I was like, wow, that's so nice that that this is happening here, and that you're all interested to hear about the research that Jed and I have done. So our research project, we sort of titled Making Place, Placing Makers. And our intention in that is connecting history, memory, and land through indigenizing New Hampshire Public Library local history collections. I want to make it clear before we sort of get into it that we'll use the term we a lot in our presentation. When we say we don't speak for Indigenous peoples, we're speaking for ourselves. And that means for me and for Jed as white settler educators, librarians. So we're speaking we broadly as non-Indigenous people, but primarily as white people. Yeah, I feel like that's a good framing of that.
Yeah, so a big part of this is we believe that addressing shared narratives of colonial history is a big part of understanding how we interact with the land in which we live on. And that was a big part in what shaped how we did our research and what has now become our chapter that we have since published and what you'll be seeing the presentation on tonight. It kind of stemmed from the intersection of sort of studies that was mentioned that I was doing at the time, looking at the way cultural memory and specifically post-conflict and post-genocide societies affects how we view our history, and then vice versa, how we view the land. In a big way, that our idea of that is shaped is through our public library local history collections. If you have a question about what, if you have you want to see what the oldest deed was in this town, or you want to see the oldest book in this town, you go to your local library and you look in that local history collection, you want to see what they have. And by doing that and collaborating together, we kind of started looking and piecing that together and taking apart some of the local history collections that around us, and then furthermore created the survey and then the research that came out of that, which revealed quite a bit of information about how we view our land, and also the first people who are still here but have been so silenced and so erased in so many ways.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So what we'll be going through in this presentation, who we worked with and why. Some shared definitions, language, especially in this presentation, is, at least for us on the call and in the room, to understand what words we were using and why we're using them is really important in this, especially when we're talking about identity and cultural memory. Can be really, things can get murky pretty fast. So having some shared definitions is really important. Then going over how we linked our cultural understanding of land with the way libraries have documented that. Our results from our survey, the resource guide that Lou and myself created, and then of course at the end the published findings that we had.
Okay, thanks so much, Jed.
And so for people we worked with, how we decided what Indigenous groups to work with, we, rather than working with just one or trying to narrow it down to one specific idea of what Abenaki is, we looked at what, if we were libraries, who would we be reaching out to if we were starting from ground zero, which many libraries in the state are. And specifically what that came up with was we were able to collaborate with multiple speakers for the Abenaki peoples in different locations, which is pretty rare these days in terms of what was out there for research. So we were super, super indebted to the groups that we did get to work with. Those being the Abenaki of Odanak, which is a First Nation reserve over the border in Canada. We worked with Daniel Nolet, Susie Obamsuin, and David Bernard there, and they were extremely, extremely helpful and knowledgeable. And then also we worked with Paul and Denise Pulio, who some of you are probably already aware of. If you've paid attention at all to Indigenous issues within the state, you have definitely seen their name. They have been leading sort of the charge on these issues and creating this space for these conversations for the last 2 decades or more in this state. And again, yeah, could not have done this project without them. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to sort of mention that in working with multiple groups, there's a deep fracturing of Abenaki nationhood as a result of colonization. So that choice to work with as many people as were willing to work with us is a very conscious one of trying to include as many voices as possible. So I think it's just important to mention that in the framework of like who we worked with and how we chose to do that. Defining terms. So as Jed said, white supremacy, for example, these are big terms that we hear a lot in many different contexts. So I'm just going to sort of read through the definition that we employed in our research, and it's also one that we use for writing the chapter and sort of coming to our own understanding of our privilege and how we approach different conversations. So we're borrowing here from Frances Lee Ansley, and this is from an article called Stirring the Ashes. So we understand white supremacy as a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So it's really vast. It's a big definition there. And this sort of how we try to pull it into working in libraries and in the local history rooms is there's sort of an understanding of libraries as neutral, equal spaces. And we are definitely working towards that. And this program and our research is part of that process, but libraries are not, in Jed and my opinion, are not neutral spaces. They were born out of sort of the Enlightenment project and have definitely participated in assimilationist initiatives and the ways in which we come to know the local history room collections through our research. It's not a neutral history there either. So we're sort of employing the definition of white supremacy in libraries and in library and information science. There's the smaller box to the right there. That's the sort of where we're pulling in the idea of white supremacy and sort of trying to move towards library neutrality, but understand that that's not the historical reality. So in order to upend the relationship between library and information studies and white supremacy, we have to sort of address the very notion of how white supremacy and libraries are intersected. So that's how we're coming to the research.
Yeah, so three more terms that are pretty fundamental to the presentation in our research, obviously, is indigenization, which we defined as a process of naturalizing indigenous knowledge systems and making them evident to transform spaces, places, and hearts. And that was a definition from Chelsea Bowell. And then also decolonization, with the prioritization of indigenous knowledges, voices, practices, and lived experiences while decentering whiteness. And then further, settler, the non-Indigenous peoples living in Canada and the United States who form the European descended socio-political majority. And a big part of this is, especially in this room in the presentation, and probably most people on the call, is recognizing that settler colonialism, and why we say settler colonialism as opposed to just colonialism, is that settler colonialism is a unique form of colonialism that's different than just there's resource exploitation form of colonialism where you're just going and just taking resources, right? Settler colonialism is unique in that it seeks to replace what's there and use the land for its own people, so that the settlers, right, are the ones colonizing. The land is what the resources that is after, and the people already there are in the way of that. Whereas oftentimes in other forms of colonization, the people who are there are the colonizers depend on those people staying there. In settler colonialism, it doesn't work that way. In fact, it's the opposite. So that's an important distinction.
And I think another thing I want to just sort of like pull out from this slide and the definitions that we have here of knowledge systems, knowledges, voices, practices, those are all plural. And again, that's like a conscious choice on our end of choosing these definitions because of the multiplicity of the groups that we worked with, and also the plurality that exists within not just one Indigenous nation, but all multiple Indigenous groups that we worked with. So I think something that we wanted to be cognizant of is that we're speaking to some representatives from various Abenaki groups, but they still are just speaking from their experience. So there's definite plurality to what we're pulling on. So that's why we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, plural. Is this still me? Yes, it's still me. Okay, a big quote here. Roxanne Dunmore Ortiz, there's a book of hers on the table of books over here in the corner. If you're here in person, if you're online, you can search her in the catalog. I'm sure she's got a great collection of books. And this is from a book that she wrote. I think it's the one on the table, maybe even, but and the quote is, "Everything in US history is about the land," which sort of returns to what Jed was saying. Who oversaw and cultivated it, fished its waters, maintained its wildlife, then who invaded and stole it. So land in settler colonization is a really important resource. That's what the grab is after. So in our research, we were really trying to draw connections between land, the history of land, and the presence and present day of land. So I think this quote is just a really nice one that sort of like offers an opening into what we're going to get into.
Okay, so for a bit about our framework, we focused on libraries and local history collections within the boundaries of the Wabanaki Confederacy and specifically of the Abenaki Nation, mostly because we were choosing to focus around what we now call New Hampshire, what we as residents of, for me as a resident of New Hampshire at that time, both of us looking at that state, like working within the system in which we were studying, but recognizing that the Abenaki Nation and the Wabanaki Confederacy exist outside of those state boundaries. So we really focused it around New Hampshire specifically and wanted to investigate the relationship between the collections and the lived local histories and the shared understanding of land, as Luke mentioned as well.
So when we're getting into the specific case of New Hampshire differs from some of the neighboring New England states, which would be Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, even New York and Rhode Island, in that New Hampshire doesn't have any federally or state recognized tribal land. Some of the other states in New England don't have federally recognized land, but they do have state recognized land. So that's just something to be cognizant of as a New Hampshireite. And at the same time, there's a multitude of towns and public libraries that mark the appropriation of Indigenous language, mostly through place taking. So the way that towns were named was usually borrowing or appropriating language from the Indigenous peoples that live there, and then sort of taking it into an anglicized way. So there's some examples there that might seem familiar to you. Another important fact about New Hampshire is that Peterborough is the site of the first free public library that was totally supported by taxation in the US. So we have like a great, many firsts sort of here. And Dartmouth College, which is in Hanover, was actually originally founded for education and instruction of youth in Indian tribes. So it's not really known as a residential school, but it can be understood as employing some of the same praxis as those schools. So that's all just sort of like baseline facts that I think are important to understand or just know as we continue to talk about understanding New Hampshire today as residents and folks that visit the libraries here.
Okay, so getting into some of the statistics of the survey, we tried to get representation from all counties within the state in terms of the libraries that we used in the study, and what that entailed was questions around what was in the local history collections, the size of those local history collections, et cetera. I think we get into that more later. But so this was the representation of each county and the amount of survey responses that we got back. So as you'll see, not all of the counties are represented. As you get into more rural areas, obviously the resources also get smaller, and the ability of those librarians and whatnot in those counties are not quite as large as some of the other more wealthy counties. So you can see that in some of the data that we got here.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember if we get into it later, and I don't know. So I think I'll just frame quickly, because we're referring to the survey without totally talking to you about what exactly it was. But essentially, as Jed and I started to have conversations with the folks from Odanak and Paul and Denise, there was clearly a lack of connection point between the Indigenous peoples and the libraries. And we wanted to sort of understand what efforts were being made, or, because we wanted to know what libraries were doing, what questions they might have. And there wasn't really a great way for us to physically go to all the libraries and have those conversations. So we made a survey that asked questions about the local history rooms, the collections that were in those spaces, as well as how contemporary collection development was taking shape for contemporary Indigenous authors or Abenaki authors in specific. And we wanted to know also about programming partnerships that the libraries had or were curious about having. So we created a survey that asked all those questions, and then we sent it by email through a listserv that exists for New Hampshire libraries. And we also did a lot of cold calling to the libraries and asking if they would be interested in filling out this survey. And these are the representation statistics from the results that we got for that survey.
So for that, 62% of the responding libraries responded that they did have a dedicated local history room, and on average, these rooms are accessed by the public more than 5 times a month. 25% of responding libraries estimated the size of their local history collection to be 1,000 items or more. And then 61% of responding libraries said that they have materials in their local history collection that are not cataloged or kept. And so the big part of this was recognizing that these collections are not static for one, they're in the public realm. and people are using them. So in that way, they are shaping the way people are understanding the land on which they live. And not only that, but one of the, as Lou already said, like one of the things that was reiterated time and again by the Indigenous peoples we worked with was that they just didn't know what libraries had, like what artifacts they had, what books they had that are not, because I think maybe it's in a different, 61% of responding libraries have materials in their local history collection that are not cataloged or keyed. So they have things, they know they have things, but they don't, there's no way for the public, or if you're an Indigenous person trying to know where or what a local library has, for you to know. And especially working with the Pulios, and as well with Odanak as well, you know, they would say like, we know someone has these things, we can trace it up to this point, but after that we hit a wall, and usually that wall is some form of local bureaucracy that won't allow them to know. And that was even expressed in small group survey data that we interviewed with librarians, that they suspected that they had things, but they knew their board would not be interested in pursuing that, because then it would get into a murky debate of what does rematriation or repatriation look like for those items, and who is in charge of that, which is a whole other conversation as well.
Yeah. I also, I'm a librarian, so I also want to like be really cognizant of the fact that local history rooms are often a space that like 5 times a month is great, and that's the average, that's not all of them. So that sometimes can be sort of like a back burner issue, I guess you would say, because there's so much that happens here. Libraries are great, and they're transforming like very fluid space, particularly post-COVID, like, or, you know, like as we reopened after lockdown. I think it's like, it's a lot that happens here. So what I don't want anyone to take away is like, oh, well, public librarians should be doing things differently. Like, I mean, we can all do things differently. We can all grow, but I think the reality is like things not being cataloged or keyed in archives or in local history collections is very, very common. It's not like just in New Hampshire or just in public libraries. That's something that happens in a lot of archival and historically oriented spaces. So it's less of a, well, this should have been done differently, and more, what can we do now moving forward to make this a better, more approachable thing that someone from Odanak would potentially be able to look at a digitized item or a cataloged item. Like, how do we make that process easier and less of a, why has this been so hard so long? So I just want to name that as well. Okay, and that sort of like gets into how library staff and how constituents also can call their libraries, or, you know, have conversations with your friends, with your family, see what their libraries are doing in terms of working with Indigenous groups in their locales. So one of the survey questions was, in the past 10 years, has your library partnered with any of the following tribal nations or organizations? And on the right-hand side are some of the ones that we named, and then the other is just, you could enter one in, but that's the Kowalskic Band of the Penaquid, so that's Denise and Paul. The Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective is the second one. The Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum is the third. And the fourth one is the New Hampshire Center for Native American Awareness. And so the scale is 0 to 3. Not very large for more than 200 libraries in New Hampshire, but that just means that there's an opening, there's a possibility there. So that's why I think it's important for anyone that's on the call, you know, even if you're not a New Hampshire resident, like, these are questions that you're totally encouraged to ask to your public librarians. Like, hey, I really want to know about this, or like, what is in our local history room? If this is available to the public, these are sort of things that you can call for. And that's definitely something that we recommend, because we don't want the onus to be on organizations like this to have to do outreach in order for them to be heard. It should sort of be the other way around, that public spaces like this are calling in and calling out to those organizations and individuals from those organizations, and sort of having them be flooded with invitations for presentations and awareness and education campaigns.
That's what, yeah,
This is still me. You're gonna still hear me talking. Okay. This is actually, we had like an interesting, you can see between the next two slides, like a sort of pretty visual example. The question is, would your library consider building relationships with New Hampshire tribal nations and support organizations as part of your local history collection development and just general programming processes? So a majority of libraries said yes. This is a question about diversity audit, collection diversity audits, which a collection diversity audit is, when I say collection, that's usually the print or digital resources that a library houses. So that's largely the books and the audiobooks, the films, the collections are what makes up the things that you can borrow from the library. So a collection diversity audit is looking at and analyzing the representation that collection has, looking for gaps, how you can fill those gaps, or maybe there's a majority of this, how can you scale that back but still maintain its integrity? So sort of what areas need to be better developed. It's a process basically of determining whose perspective is maybe overrepresented or pedestaled and whose perspective is missing within the library collection. So when we're asking, would your library be open to the idea of a local history collection diversity audit, what we found was that there are some very relevant historical books, and particularly around Western Abenaki language, that a lot of New Hampshire libraries had, but they might not have had them in the local history collection. So there's books that the Indigenous peoples we interviewed would say are historically relevant for them and for their peoples, and we didn't see them in local history rooms in the library. So that's sort of what a collection audit would get to. And it was sort of like an unsure, which I think would maybe speak to collection diversity audits are a relatively new, like wide approach. So that could be why there's some hesitation there, but almost half were yes. So that's a really great thing. I feel like there was I don't know. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, I'm confusing myself, but not you, hopefully. But I guess what I wanted to say about the visualization or the juxtaposition here is that almost 73% of libraries said that they're interested in partnering with support organizations and tribal nations. So there's a deep interest there. And the actuality or the reality of the number of libraries and library staff that are making those connections is quite small. So there's clearly an interest, but there's just not the connection points happening. So what we're hoping from the resource guide that we made is to make those connections a bit easier so that there's like one place where you can go and try and make direct connection with various organizations that are doing really, really good work. Okay, that's my statistics.
Yeah, so just one other thing. This is we've mostly done this presentation for librarians and archivists. And so one of the main contributing voices to this was the first archivist circle, which you see at the bottom left. And basically what that is, just in case anyone's curious, it was a group of primarily Indigenous and First Nation communities and archivists like met in 2006 and created a best practice standards for how archivists and librarians can go about dealing with this sort of data, and also rematriating and repatriating and collaborating with Indigenous groups. So that information is out there. I feel like, as Lou was just saying before, often there's a lot of interest, but the bridge to the information is what's lacking. And this is, so that is a resource that was super helpful for us in writing this chapter, and probably would be as well for other people who are in the field. And then you speak to the word idea.
Okay. On the right-hand side, you'll see this sort of historical literature review and a list of titles. Part of what our research and what's published in our chapter is the most prevalent history books about New Hampshire history, essentially, in local history collections. And we went through them and sort of analyzed them for the way in which they speak about Indigenous peoples, the the ways in which they do or don't contend or speak to the same historical events and happenings. And then we also shared a list of these and some digital copies with the folks at Odanak as well. And Paul and Denise are pretty familiar with most of these, but sort of trying to pull out, if you go to the local history room, which I've worked at a reference desk for a long time, where we're sort of the first contact point where folks are coming in, maybe they're from the area, they just moved to the area, or their family is from here, but they've moved elsewhere and they just want to do some general history research into the area, and we direct them to that history room. And oftentimes, like at least in the few libraries that I've worked at in New Hampshire, there's like the ready reference right behind the desk where you have a copy of really popular history books. That's some of these, like the Belknap one it's also like on the New Hampshire state site for learning more about New Hampshire history. So these are like canonical texts on New Hampshire history. And when you pull them out and start reading through them, there's some really harmful depictions of Indigenous peoples. And our questions are sort of about what that does to build community here. Like, how does that build an understanding of what happened in what is now known as New Hampshire, and what is happening now, and what can we do to move forward if we don't have a shared understanding of what happened here. So this list of titles is sort of like ones that we invite you to look at with like a critical lens, I think. I'm sure that Portsmouth has some of these in the collection, so if you're so intrigued, you can pull them out and make some of your own deductions. You don't have to just rely on us. In fact, we don't want you to. You should exactly go into the local history room and ask these questions and have these conversations with people that you care about. I think it's going to be a particularly niche book, I think, but the book that our chapter is in is called Land and Libraries. It's up to the left. Happy to share a link with you all afterwards, so you can send that out to people. But it's going to be a lot of different research projects, not just ours, on the connection between land and libraries, and also education, with education as a main focus. So that's forthcoming. It's supposed to come out in a few months, I think. But and the last thing that we'll sort of go through and show you is we made a resource guide that is, as Jed said, sort of primarily geared towards library staff and archivists, but it's just as, I think, interesting for anyone that's interested in this topic, which is hopefully everyone. So we can go through a little bit our shared website. Before I do that, do you want to have any final?
I think maybe it would be useful also to just define, I realize in this talk, we're using the term cultural memory a lot, and that's something we talk a lot about in our research paper, but it's not something that we've defined, at least like as I shared in this room or on this call. And what we mean by that is specifically when I say cultural memory, I mean the things that are not necessarily what we think we know about a place, but what we see on a day-to-day basis. The shared cultural memory is the memory that is represented in our culture around us. And that can be in colloquialisms that we use in our language. That can be in the names of places, as Lou mentioned, in terms of what we call places, and then what we know that to be or not know that to be. And it can also be in terms of physical landmarks, right? In terms of what we see every day, in terms of statues, in terms of monuments, flags, etc. So just so we're all kind of clear about what that means. We've used that term a lot, but I don't think we've defined it. So I would just say that's that.
Our definition. Yes, thank you. That's great. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Maybe I can't do this.
While Lou's loading that, some fun facts about the land that I like throwing in, because these are not so much in our paper, but are in terms of our understanding of the land, just some interesting statistics. According to Fish and Wildlife, by 1854, turkeys, our beloved turkeys that are in every road in the US today, were extinct in this state, completely gone. And in 1975, 25 were reintroduced to the state, and now the population is up to 40,000. And not only that, by 1851, 70% of the state south of the White Mountains was completely clear cut. So if you imagine the woods you see today, and since then, the White Mountains has been completely clear cut. There are most of the trees you see today on a day-to-day basis. You're lucky if they're 200 years old. And so when you think of, the land acknowledgement that we had earlier that talk about generations and generations of people who lived here before this, how old those trees were, how long they had used those rivers, how many turkeys there were at that time, the biodiversity that existed on this land at that time. When we talk about the land and cultural memory, I think those are important understanding statistics to bring into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. I hope so. Yeah. Okay.
We can't see your screen.
Oh.
How do I get back?
Okay, hang on one second. Jed, don't you have more interesting facts?
You don't know if I do have any more interesting facts.
There should be.
I'm interested.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I think it is interesting. We've talked a lot about land,
Is that
and
okay?
then, gets to this point in the conversation, we've mostly talked about libraries and not the land. But,
Okay.
it is interesting to think, what that must have been like, to go from, I saw 50 turkeys on the road today, and that's the most turkeys I've ever seen in my life. To zero, there's no metaphor to compare that to when that's been generations of your life, in your culture. And then also, if you think about the amount of dams that exist, or specifically in New England and New Hampshire, that was a big part of our culture today, right? Is mill towns based on dams that were used, that are a big part of our, right? When we talk about cultural memory now, how that land has shaped our cultural memory, especially in New Hampshire. Dams are a big part of that. What that did to anadromous fish, I live in Nashville. I lived down the street from a place called Salmon Brook. There's no salmon that has ever been in that brook in my life, but that name suggests that at one point there was, which is pretty wild to think about.
Yeah.
So, not so interesting.
I think they're interesting. So this is the resource guide that we developed, and these sort of framing questions I think are great questions for anyone. They're also the take action things are things that can also be largely employed in your personal life or in your work life. So some of those things are just partnering with Indigenous groups, nations, and bands in general. There's always ways that you can do that. And like I said, if I don't know, maybe everyone's a Portsmouth patron, and we commend Portsmouth for the work that they do, but being curious for places that you visit as well, like going to libraries and taking note of what programs that they have on, I think is an important way to just constantly stay vigilant about this topic. And if you're sort of curious about some of the physical, like print books that we were looking at, there's a collection development tab that we built. There's the diversity audit resources, which I mentioned about analyzing the collection. These are titles that from our conversations with Abenaki leaders, they said these are historically relevant for their peoples and culture. So if you're curious about that, they're listed there, and some of them are, again, if you're in the room, they're on the table over there, I saw. So you can check those out. There's also, we wanted to be really cognizant in the work about not only just looking at the historicization and the way in which that Indigenous peoples and settler colonization makes the conversation around New Hampshire, in the past, but also in the present. How can we uplift and affirm Abenaki voices today? So there's much work for the publishing industry to do to make that more accessible, but there are some titles that we list here. And some of the titles that are listed below here, we've been working with a researcher at Abenaki to investigate some of these titles that they weren't familiar with. So it's titles that are about some of their direct lineage ancestors that they've not read or heard of, the authors of the books. So we are working with them and just sort of doing a historiography check. So those are books that you probably can access in the Portsmouth Public Library or through your local library, wherever that might be. The Abenaki contacts page is sort of similar to the folks that we listed as collaborators, but it's broader than that. Like I said, there sort of is I don't know if you want to speak to this part, maybe. So
I think you already did, but yeah, I mean, like if you have spent any time in sort of in researching or investigating Indigenous communities within the continental United States, especially in the Northeast, what you'll find is a pretty fractured community and lineage that there's a lot of disputes over representation over who gets to speak for who and who gets to be what, and I am of the opinion that is not up to me to decide, but so that is a product then of a colonial structure, right? That was the base point of colonization, was largely to single out groups and a hierarchy that was not at all what we were used to in terms of who is leading, who is in charge, create people who were in charge, and then give them whatever and take what was left, and that has since had repercussions centuries later, where these communities are still just as fractured because of that. So what we have listed here is what is available in terms of those contacts for Indigenous peoples, not only within the continental US, but specifically within New Hampshire and Vermont, recognizing that that some of these groups are disputed in terms of who is seen as Abenaki, who is not. But I don't think it does any of us any good to pretend that that's not a part of the conversation.
Yeah, and the reason that we also have the list of New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Abenaki in Canada is because these are what I would consider imagined borders. This is something that the Wabanaki Confederacy spans, these contemporary borders. So we're including these different states and nations because it's the Indigenous nations sort of bridge the boundaries and borders that colonization set into place. So that's why you're seeing those three listed there. And this is more resources. We love the resources. This page, I would say, is like definitely geared towards library staff, but again, it's interesting training opportunities and other conversations that are being led by Indigenous peoples in the New England area on the professional development side. Some of the talks given by Claudia Foxtree or Chris Newell, they're available on YouTube. You can just like cook your dinner and have them on. Like it's just a pretty accessible way to have these voices and ideas be part of your weekly practice of coming to know things and coming to unlearn things. So if you're ever looking for a good sort of easy learning opportunity, I would say this page is full of resources.
One that is really, really awesome that's on there that the Pulios have done a lot of work with is the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. That's also down here, the mapping of New Hampshire Indigenous heritage sites. That the map is incredibly interactive and incredibly detailed, and the UNH and that group have done a lot of work to make that and put it together, and it's a really great resource for the state to have, and for all of the residents.
Anyone that lives in the state, it's a really great thing. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm gonna see if I can master going back to. Do you see the presentation now or still just, okay, I'm gonna do something else. Okay, just for this beautiful slide that says questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. And it like, I know that was a lot of information, and because we're coming from a sort of critical studies, analytical lens, where I know we're like throwing a lot of terminology, but we're also, I mean, we're both born and raised in New Hampshire. This is land that we both really care about. So I want this to feel like informal and inviting. That you don't, there's no wrong question or curiosity or statement, or I don't know if I understand or agree with that, but anything is welcome.
I'm the collections librarian at Rogers Memorial Library.
Yeah.
I'm also Abenaki,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to hold all our books. Like you said, it's fractured, just like our nation is, and there's bits and pieces all over to put them in. But unfortunately, Library of Congress, their numbers don't.
Yeah.
Don't. I don't want to say allow you to, but if you want to break the rule,
Mm-hmm.
to set aside particularly data studies.
Mm-hmm.
What are your suggestions as far as that?
Sure, that's a great question. I think it definitely depends on the library and also oftentimes the administrative support that you have. It's the library that I was just working at, we were trying to move away from Dewey and towards BISAC codes, and then that sort of becomes a little bit easier for you to like make your own groupings. So I'm here to break the rules though, right? Like the rules were set by people I don't agree with. So I think,
And I you know,
yeah.
so I'm trying to work around that Dewey system.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a history room.
Okay.
Our library is not as huge as this. But, you know, I do have a section that I'm
Mm-hmm.
setting aside, you know, it's town history, state history.
Yeah.
But it's just working within the confines that I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that our collection is light on data.
Mm-hmm.
So for Indigenous Peoples Day, I made sure there was a big display.
Yeah.
I dug through everything that we possibly had. So, you know, it's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
But I did want to make one. I really appreciate the fact that you didn't call us tribes. I really did appreciate that, because
Okay.
that is, we're not tribes, it's a colonialism.
Mm.
We are sovereign nations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I appreciate that, but thank you for your help.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I've been to a movie at your library.
What's that?
We've been to a movie there.
Also, there you go. Both things.
Yeah, there's one other, I think, I mean, I appreciate that question because it's something I think most of us in library work are sort of thinking about. You know, if you're acquiring new titles on Indigenous issues, it's like, okay, are they gonna go in the 300s as social issues, or like oftentimes they're placed in the 900s just like that. And there is a part in the chapter where we sort of speak to a lot of the titles that are available on Abenaki language. They've been reprinted now, so we sort of advocate for purchasing reprints and making them part of the circulating collection and cataloging. Yeah, and cataloging them with the 400s. And there's I did find in the newest DDC, there's like a sub number that's like
Right.
possible. So, but I think it's a hard question. And I mean, that sort of any attempt that you can make that like feels good for you and for your library and that community like is the right way. So I don't.
And the other thing with that came up a lot in our research was the recognition that, especially right in terms of history, you're talking about nations who primarily have used oral history, right? And so even the idea of, and we talk about this in our chapter, but moving that into a written form was an act of colonization that they didn't want a written form of
Right.
Abenaki history. Like we actively tried to prevent that, you know, so.
Well, Cherokee were the first ones to develop their own.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I think I would just, you know, offer you that as like, it's also, the absence speaks to that as well, right? The absence of those offerings being available. And that is for a reason.
Mhm.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Just as a case study, the University of British Columbia, their college library has like an indigenous classification system they
Mm.
use. I don't know if you've come across that, but
I don't know if that specific one, but I know of some others too, yeah.
it's, you know, fun to take a look at those and get some of
Where
them.
is it from?
The University of British Columbia, I wish, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but the,
Librarian.
yeah,
Thank you, that's great. Other questions, comments? Concerns?
define rematriation and repatriation.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, that can look like many things. In terms of the rematriation versus repatriation, I would define them similarly. I don't know if there's a big difference in terms of the like matriation or patriation.
I think it's just the politicization of the gendered language, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of that, defining that would be when you know, it's a pretty modern idea that when certain collections are audited or when museums, this just happened somewhere in England, but museums, libraries, personal collections, sometimes you find them in people's houses after they've died, you know, they have relics or whatnot. It's the returning of those pieces of artifacts of cultural history or significance to the peoples to which they belong to, I think would be the
Yeah.
easiest way to define that.
But it's also deeply rooted in land. There's a few Indigenous led land trusts in New England as well that are focused on rematriating land to Indigenous peoples. So I mean, it applies in that context as well. It's just returning what is not ours. And when I say ours, I mean Jedi, white settlers, what is not ours to the people that it belongs to.
Can I make a statement on that?
Yeah.
The idea is it's ill-gotten artifacts, not artifacts that were, say, passed down to you.
Mm.
For example, I was out in Pine Ridge, Copeland Reservation, and I found a projectile point. And I brought it back to the elder on Pine Ridge, and I said, "Here, I found this. I want to make sure, I don't want to take it."
Mm.
And he goes, "Did you dig it up?" I said, "No." He goes, "Did you purposely go looking for it?" And I said, "No." He goes, "It found you."
Mm.
So he said, "You are free to take that because it was meant for you to have it." Now, if you go and dig up a home site or a grave and take what was there, that's grave robbing, or as we call it, archaeology. But that's the difference, because some things that were made for trade goods. I went out to the Boston Museum of Science where they had a native collection of artifacts. And there were certain things that I would not go look at because they were ill-gotten. And I refused. But then I walked into another room with my professor who was teaching cultural law. And he goes, "When you went in there," I said, "That's trade goods. That's native made stuff. It was sold to the white people on the trains and they'll go back and forth. That's how they made money." He goes, "They have no practical use. They're just trinkets that they sold back to you guys."
Mm.
So, you know, there's a difference. Just because you have something that was made by a native, I've got tons of stuff that were, and on the bottom, If the artist wrote out his name or her name and put their people's name, DNA or whatever. That was made for you to take home as a quote unquote souvenir. It wasn't dug up taken out of a cave or from a grave or from. So there is a difference, and you can still have native artifacts, because anything you take is an artifact is just something. So you can have a native artifact that's perfectly fine. But then if you got a skeleton in your closet, that's a whole different story. So you got to define what the artifact is. And that's part of that repatriation. If it's an ill-gotten artifact, like a lot of the stuff that was collected in the late 1700s, early 1800s, then that's what needs to be given back and given properly, taken care of properly by the people.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that furthering of our, that's great, thank you.
From the new direction. Question.
Okay, let's see. Is it the one,
Yeah, that one, buddy.
Frank?
Yeah.
Okay, oh, I see. Okay, so we have a question. In your research of local history rooms, do you know what percentage of the authors were Indigenous? Of the resources there, do you know what percent represents what would be defined as an accurate history? Do you want to speak to that, or you want me to?
I think it would be better.
Okay, I will speak to that. So that's a large question, and I think is difficult to answer, particularly because, as we sort of mentioned with or you see from the survey results, we don't actually know what is in a lot of the local history rooms. So the statistics and the literature review that listed the titles that were most prevalent in libraries was a combination of like calling and asking, and also doing catalog searches. So we were looking in what was available to look through online catalogs. So I couldn't answer that accurately because we don't know what's in every library in the state. We just saw that a lot of them have Belknap and a lot of them have, like some of these other titles, but what percentage of the authors were Indigenous in the local history rooms? I don't have a percentage. Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have a percentage, but I think on our site that lists the historically relevant titles, that would be mostly written by 3 or 4 authors. So Abenaki authors. So just names, not percentages, if that answers that question.
And in terms of the second part of that question, what was it?
Do you,
Represents accurate, what percent represents accurate history? The answer to that is very murky as well, but something I think that adds some light to the answer to that question, or at least illuminates other parts of that question. But in some interviews we did with the folks at Odanak, they have a library on their First Nation, on their reserve, and we asked them about their, like how they catalog their library and their local history collection. And one of the things that they said is that they really are, they're not trying to prevent any of these books from being read. And they recognize that what is out there for local history does not portray Abenaki people or Indigenous people well at all. We're talking about books where they are depicted as subhuman, referred to as subhuman. And these are in their libraries. But what they do is put warnings at the beginning of the book, or I don't know if warnings is the word that they would have used, but sort of like content descriptions that say, this is what you're about to read. We don't agree with this, but this is, in terms of what we talk about as an accurate account of history, those views from that author at that time, that was an accurate description according to that author, which I think what to their point was saying is important that we all understand, is that is what has shaped us to this present day, or ideologies and histories like that. and they're not looking to prevent people from seeing that.
Can I say something to that?
Yes,
Histories are written by the dominant society.
exactly.
And you're looking at, it is, my major is heritage studies.
Mhm.
That's what my master's. And there's three sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth.
Mhm.
So. Again, whatever the dominant society is, you're looking at it through their eyes. So then they're not gonna admit if they did something wrong. They're gonna see it as they saw it. Good example is Rogers Ranger's raid on the Abenaki in St. Francis. To the eyes of the colonial settlers, it was a great victory. To the eyes of the native people, it was a massacre of women and children. Which side is right? Both, actually, depending on whose eyes you look through.
Mhm.
So how much of that history is accurate? Depends on who's writing it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for adding that. And I think that was the sort of the opinion of, Daniel, I think it was Susie that spoke to that specifically of we want there to sort of be both so that this conversation can continue to happen. If we remove the harmful depictions, like that doesn't actually serve our mission or our aim. I don't think so. No. Any other questions, comments? Yeah,
That's a strange question, then.
okay.
Is there any book, or research material that lists all the sovereign nation, indigenous of the continental United States?
It's a great question. It gets a little murky because when we talk about that, they're like recognized indigenous nations. I think there's 573 federally recognized nations, and there are maps and books of those. But those are federally recognized. So the Abenaki in New Hampshire and Vermont would not fall on that map.
So there's nothing that covers like all three levels, federal, state,
and pre-colonization, that's where, right, because that would be the next part is there are so many nations that we'll never know.
well, that's
Because
that's what I wondered.
Yeah.
How many were there and how long did they last?
There are
They split up
some
and
really
get
good
together.
books that address a lot of that. Facing Eastern Indian Country is a really good one that really deals specifically with that time period in what I've read. I'm not sure if you're familiar
What
with
was
it.
that
It's called Facing East from Indian Country.
For Nadine
Facing east from Indian country.
from India?
That really frames sort of like the time period directly at the start of what we now see as the birth of the US. From an indigenous perspective in a really incredible way, recognizing that most of the people at that time had already been through what we would see now as like a mass genocide in terms of the amount of people who died due to diseases. And so we're talking about people who already knew 5 or 6 languages at that time because they were from different nations. But at that time, we would have described them all as one people. So I would say that is a good place. That book is a really good place to start. I don't know if you would.
There are a lot of really good books out there that, and like he was saying, that there's because most of the native nations in this country are divided up into linguistic groups. And up here it would be the Algonquian language group, but that means absolutely nothing, because Native people in Maine, which are part of my nations, my relatives, they speak a version of Algonquian that is not recognized by the Wampanoags on Cape Cod, who are still speaking an Algonquian based language, it's just a base. When I've given talks on this, I compare it to, let's say, Latin. Because French, Spanish, Italian are all the version, part of the Latin grouping, but they're not the same languages. So that's tough, but there were a lot of subgroups because we're throwing out the term Abenaki a lot, but there are so many different subgroups within the Abenaki. I mean, the Pennacook were all through Nashua, but part of the Pennacook Nation were the Nashua people.
Mhm.
And then there's my people with the Pikwakit people, which were up near Ossipee and almost in Maine. And there were no borders, so they kind of, it was just fluid. So to say Abenaki as one people,
Mhm.
you can't, because there's so many stuff. The Kawasaks were another group of Abenaki. They weren't definitive. Then you get the Abenaki up in Vermont and up in Odenak, in southern Quebec.
Yeah.
And into Maine. And then don't even get me started on the Iroquois people, because they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Or the Siouan people, you know, they're so there's so many, so there's no, I don't think you're gonna find one text that's definitive to say, and you're gonna find a lot that are gonna be conflicting with each other. Because don't forget, those are written through the eyes of the white person.
Yeah.
Who has definitive lines of this is where they were. No, they spread, it was ebb and flow. And they didn't stay in one spot very long. They moved with the game and for the seasons and stuff, so you may say they're here, but in the winter, they may be over there.
Yeah.
So it's tough, so you're gonna have to get a lot of different texts together and compile the information, so.
There is a
I
web.
was gonna negative, yeah, okay, I was, yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is so true. I think a good, or at least like one of the most frequently, I think, like shared resources that I've come across in terms of trying to understand more about mapping the United States in terms of Indigenous peoples is nativeland.ca. It started in Canada, but now it's like very crowdsourced, and
Might be native dash.
it has a dash in the middle. Yeah, I don't know if I can.
And you can plug in your zip code. It's pretty interactive as well. You can move it around, but you plug in your zip code and it will show you what Indigenous nations. And as you were saying, a lot of them overlap. So you'll see that there are multiple
Okay,
nations.
show. And they have, okay, I'll show. Can everyone see that? Yes. Yeah, so they have a disclaimer, it's not, does not represent or intend to represent official or legal boundaries of any Indigenous nations, and they, you know, it's not perfect, they like have this claim, but when you go to the map, you can enter in your zip code, I don't know what it is.
Zip address.
3801.
Fort Smith. So, and then this is a list of local nations, and sometimes it'll bring you to an active website of a nation, and other times there might not be more information. And the mapping is sort of broad. It's like shaped in some ways, but it's definitely overlaps in a way that not most maps of Indigenous nations do. So I think that's a good resource, but as they say, it's not perfect. But they're glad we're here. That's nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? No. Okay. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us and everyone who joined us.
Yeah.